a sociologist. I'm not a lawyer, all right? So I'm going to talk about sovereignty in relation to social construction. I want to talk about it in relation to race, and also to talk a little bit about why it's so important and why we need to shift the discourse from race-based ideas to the idea of sovereignty, nationhood, peoplehood, and these types of concepts. Very important, very, very important. The problem of interpretation in terms of what does Native American sovereignty mean, we can define it very quickly, very easily as the right of a Native American nation to choose its destiny, right? And you can define it in many other ways. But I don't believe that for many people in the United States as well as Canada, that it makes a lot of sense. People really don't understand it. They have a hard time of figuring out exactly what it is. And this is one of the things that I believe causes a lot of conflict. So I think we need to think about the audience, and I think we need to think about perceptions of different audiences, how different audiences are going to perceive what sovereignty is, how they're going to define it. We can talk about a Native American audience. They're going to perceive it and define it and talk about it in terms of its meaning quite differently, let's say, from citizens in upstate New York, right? Where they're going to define the meaning of sovereignty quite differently. And also, if we think about the international community, they're going to have perhaps another meaning attached to that definition. So it's a very difficult concept to find. People have many meanings of what it is, what it's about, if it should be, if it shouldn't. And as I said, this causes a great deal of conflict. Part of the problem deals with people's knowledge base. I mean, this series is so important in relation to developing people's understanding, awareness, having a Native voice in terms of issues that the Native people in this area are concerned with, particularly the Onondaga Nation, right, and the whole land rights issue, as well as Onondaga Lake. And without this series, you know, this wouldn't happen. We wouldn't have that. And so the problem then is in terms of a knowledge base. People don't have the knowledge base to understand and comprehend contemporary issues and problems facing the Native people today. Another issue deals with political socialization, all right? When we talk about sovereignty, we talk about Native rights, we're talking about group rights, we're talking about nations, all right? And where is that in any class in junior high or high school? To a good extent, when you look at the way most Americans define rights, it is in relation to individual rights, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. And then you start to see people talking about group rights. We have rights to do this, we have rights to do that, and they just shake their head. It's simply not part of the way that they have been politically socialized in school, and it's not part of the discourse, generally speaking. The other thing we really need to think about, and when we talk about this issue of sovereignty, is we really do need to raise an epistemological question, which is a 10-cent word for how do we know what we know, all right? Where does our knowledge base come from? And if we start to look at that, we find that we don't get a lot of knowledge or understanding or education about Native people in school, and pretty much that knowledge talks about people in the past. We also get information, particularly from the media, all right, both movies and television, as well as books, magazines, newspapers, and they're usually produced by people in the dominant culture. They're not produced by Native people, right? Although there have been tremendous strides made in relation to Native American writers and documentaries and all kinds of things, which is great. But by and large, you still have this stereotype. And I graduated from Syracuse in 1967. We had tradition back then. 67 is the best; it surpasses all the rest. But beyond that, we had, I thought I was standing there, and I said to myself, when I was a senior and I had my diploma, I said, in 30 years, we're not going to be talking about stereotypes anymore. You know, I was really naive, really young and naive. And the reality is that we're still doing it. So we think of Native people in terms of hunter, in terms of this romantic savage. And I hate to use those things because, you know, it's racist in the sense of using it, but I still think it's very true. And as Fagan, who's a well-known sociologist, has this to say about stereotypes in relation to Native people. It was the era of Western expansion that imprinted on the Euro-American mind, in the dime novels and later in the movies and TV programs, the image of cruel Native American warriors attacking helpless settlers, yet the much more significant savagery of the white settlers has seldom been accentuated in the mass media. So we basically, you know, we get part of the story, all right? And it's always a story from the dominant culture, all right, in terms of who's telling the story. We also, in terms of talking about the social construction, was looking at stereotypes of Native people to justify taking of lands. Because if we look at the policy, if we look at law, to a good extent it's about land, taking land. And in New York State, we basically can argue pretty dramatically that all land west of Albany was stolen, all right? And there's no question about that. If we start looking at the United States, it was all stolen, all right? Even though we don't want to admit that. Or it was taken illegally, or people were frauded in terms of what they were paid for. But if we look at this issue of social construction in relation to you know, the taking of land, we can talk about that in the removal period and the Removal Act of the 1830s. We certainly can talk about it in the allotment and assimilation era, where Native people were socially constructed as an inferior race possessing savage habits, customs, prejudices, and therefore must be saved through Christianity by substituting white civilization for tribalism, by substituting private property for communal land holdings. And during this period, it's interesting to note that one estimate of the assault on the land base, it was reduced from 104 million acres to 8 million acres by 1891. Right? So stereotypes, you know, have a tremendous social construction of race and the use of stereotypes have a tremendous bearing on people's understanding. You also can see this in relation to Supreme Court cases, which Scott is going to deal with. But if we look at Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1831, I believe, it was one of the cases that dealt with the Trail of Tears. And most of you have heard about the Trail of Tears and the Battle of Wounded Knee, which was never a battle, but it was a massacre. And here we're dealing with the social construction in textbooks again. But those are the two stock, you know, examples that one finds in text, right? But if you look at Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, it was basically an attempt, it dealt with this period of time in terms of removal, and Georgia was trying to assert its sovereignty, its jurisdiction over Cherokee country. We had a president, Andrew Jackson, who was an old Indian fighter, who had no cause to like Native people, was more interested in his political future. And so the Cherokee were being attacked politically in relation to removal, so they went to court arguing that they were a foreign nation and that under that rubric their case would be heard in the federal court. And Chief Justice Marshall, who was the third Chief Justice of the United States, denied that. He said, you're not a sovereign nation. So wow, what's happening? Sovereignty is slipping away, okay? And he started to talk about that you are a domestic dependent nation and that you are in a state of pupillage and that your status resembles that of a ward to a guardian, right? So here we have another social construction coming out of the case law in relation to how we view Native people. And to a good extent, a lot of people say, well, Native Americans are wards, right? No, they're not wards of anything, okay? And he never said that they were wards, he said that their status resembled that of a ward to a guardian. But that stereotype, that exists today. A lot of people will talk about this issue of ward status. One of the things I'm really interested in terms of social construction is this idea of talking about Native people in relation to racial categories. And it's really unfortunate that Native people are defined in the discourse as a racial category, where race refers to a category of people who are believed to share similar characteristics that are deemed socially significant. Thus, race involves a worldview that distorts ideas about human differences and myths about diversity and abilities of people. This worldview is alive and well in our popular culture when it comes to Native Americans. And we see this in relation to controversy in terms of mascots, in terms of the University of Illinois, University of North Dakota, having such a hard time to give up their mascots. And these mascots and the way that they are presented are dehumanizing to Native students who go to those universities, as well as Native Americans generally, right? And people can't see that. They think of, well, this funny thing running around the field, but it's dehumanizing. And to a good extent, even people locally. I had a friend who was a Oneida educator, and about 8 years ago, he was invited to go to a local middle school, I guess it would be, no, elementary school. I won't name the district. And he went there and he said, well, before I talk to your class, what I'd like to do is have them draw a picture of me in terms of how I look and what kind of house I live in. And what did they draw? Teepees. And they have him in a breechcloth with feathers coming out of his head. And of course he walks in a three-piece suit, right? I mean, these things are still with us in terms of looking at this. So when we look at racist ideologies and stereotypes affecting indigenous people, we have to remember that they've also existed for centuries. We can go back to the papal bulls, where Native people were regarded as pagans, these people should be in perpetual slavery. We can look at the General Allotment Act, which I mentioned previously in terms of the taking of land. And these are the voices of the colonizer, where some groups are assigned a higher status with access to power, privilege, and prestige, while others are assigned to lower status and denied access to power and prestige. Thus, the worldview has constructed unequal populations in the world. It has been used to rationalize the destruction of indigenous culture and indigenous people through policies of genocide, forced assimilation, termination, and relocation, which has been a direct assault on tribalism, on peoplehood and sovereignty. Now, the other thing that comes up in relation to recent social construction that we find discussed in the newspapers, and particularly in relation to movements against Native American rights, is this idea of race-based rights. Race-based rights. And to a good extent, you have the stereotype that emerges from the thinking that Native Americans constitute a racial category with special rights that are denied to other citizens, right? Because of our political socialization in relation to individual rights. In other words, race-based rights. The race card is being played as a way to undermine Native American rights. It is used today as it has been in the past. And for some people, this cognitive language, it really fits, right? Race-based rights, right? Regarding race, the special privileges resonates well in central New York as well as other regions of the country, which have been affected by changes in the economy and globalization. Now, there was an interesting article in Indian Country Today that I think exemplifies this. It was written by Tom Wanamaker. It appeared in the August 8th issue, and it's entitled, People Still Don't Get It. And it's a good example of the wrong notion of that Indian rights equals special rights that are based on race. In the article, he discussed a recent Associated Press story relating to a lawsuit filed in federal court by Ajax Gaming Ventures, a Donald Trump-owned company, against West Warwick, Rhode Island, and the Narragansett Indian tribe, claiming that gaming rights are being awarded to a special race group to the exclusion of others. Thus, the suit argues that the Narragansett tribe is getting special race-based rights in violation of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which guarantees equal protection of all Americans. All right? Now, whether you are for or against Native American gaming, all right, you should know that the right of Indian tribes to pursue gaming on their territories has nothing to do with race-based rights. It has to do with the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act and their exercise of sovereignty, right? It has nothing to do with race-based anything. While many see this lawsuit as absurd, the use of race-based special rights is a powerful racist expression which would resonate well with many Americans. This stereotype then distorts reality. If we look at, I want to use one other example, and that is the American Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978. I know something about this. I was involved in this for a long time. And I use this example again to show you sovereignty and what it means. And again, this has nothing to do with race-based anything. Prior to the, if we look at this act, I'm going to just read about a page and a half. I don't like reading, all right, but it might be easier and quicker to do it this way. Prior to the passage of the act, Indian children were being placed in foster and adoptive care at 7 times the national average. This is quite an amazing rate when you realize that the Native American population of the United States was approximately 1% of the total U.S. population in the 70s. The association had received many complaints from tribes and individuals relating to the loss of children through illegal hearings and families losing their children through the intervention of state and county child social services, where children would be placed where the majority of time in non-Indian homes. In some cases, this process resulted in 25 to 35% of children being placed outside the community over a period of 20 years. The Association of American Indian Affairs published Indian Family Defense, a newsletter publicizing the problem and informing its members of the actions taken by the association in child welfare matters. William Byler, the executive director of the association, also began to contact tribes and members of Congress in relation to this problem. The association also had a staff attorney helping families and tribes across the United States with cases where children were removed from their homes through improper means. In addition, several researchers became interested in the problem and began to uncover the cause for the high rate of placement and what was happening to the children. They also found that most Indian children were being placed, as I said, in non-adoptive homes as well as non-Indian foster and adoptive homes. The consequences for the families of the tribe were clear: the breakup of the family, the loss of tribal members, and cultural genocide. A pattern of institutional discrimination emerged where non-Indians were judging Native American child-rearing practices, and they were not familiar with cultural norms in defining neglect and abuse. Anglo standards were also being used to define what were considered an appropriate standard for prospective foster and adoptive homes. Many Native families failed to meet them because the standards being used to judge child-rearing practices in Indian country and their community were ethnocentric and had no basis for reality, given the context of family, community, and culture. All right? Standards differed by state, but the pattern that emerged clearly is institutional discrimination, which is antithetical to the best interest of the tribe and of the child and the Indian nation. And I don't have time really to go into the standards per se, but I'd be happy to talk about them later. But there were things like if you wanted to qualify for an adoptive or foster care family, you had to live close to medical and educational facilities. And in some instances where you have reservation territories that are 40 to 60 miles long, 40 or 60 miles wide, that's simply impossible in terms of small villages and things. And there was a case involving, that I know of, involving the Assistant-in-Wapton Sioux tribe, which is in South Dakota, where two children were left with their grandparents while the parents went to Minneapolis, St. Paul to seek employment. And the social worker on the case saw that as an abandonment, right? Without having any understanding of the importance of the extended family and grandparents in relation to rearing children. So, without more examples, what was done? Well, in 1978, Jimmy Carter signed the Indian Child Welfare Act, which basically provided for tribes to have jurisdiction over Indian child welfare matters of children living on the territories, as well as having jurisdiction over Indian child welfare matters in all 50 states. So they would have jurisdiction in relation to, there was a child welfare case involving, let's say, the Onondaga Nation. The Onondaga Nation that was in San Francisco, the Onondaga Nation would have jurisdiction over those children in terms of what happens to them. They also determined, the act also provided for placement of Indian children's preference given to members of the child's extended family, all right, similar preference for foster care, and the standards to be used in Indian child welfare matters will be those